Let's talk about the war in Sudan is not simply a civil conflict. It is not a fight that suddenly erupted out of nowhere, nor is it a story that can be told only through the names of two armed factions, the Sudanese armed forces on one side and the rapid support forces on the other. When we hear about the battles raging in Darfur, when we read about the millions displaced and the villages burned, we must resist the temptation to see this as an isolated African tragedy. What is unfolding in Sudan is part of a much longer history of colonial exploitation, capitalist expansion, and international neglect. It is a war that tells us more about the structures of global power than about the particular leaders or generals issuing threats today. And to understand it, we need to slow down and look at the forces shaping it. Let us begin with the basic facts. Sudan is now in the throes of one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. More than 14 million people have been displaced. That number alone tells us something staggering. Half the population of the country has been forced to flee their homes. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine half the people in the United States or in Germany uprooted, wandering without shelter, food, or security. We would call it the disaster of the century. But because Sudan is poor, because it lies in Africa, because it does not figure into the strategic priorities of the United States or Europe in the same way as, say, Ukraine or Israel, this catastrophe barely registers in our headlines. That silence, that neglect, is itself a symptom of how global capitalism ranks human lives according to their utility for the centers of power. The fighting pits the Sudanese armed forces against the rapid support forces, a paramilitary group with deep roots in the Janjaweed militias that terrorized Darfur 2 decades ago. Both sides claim legitimacy, both recruit by force, and both have committed atrocities. Civilians are trapped between them. There are reports of massacres, ethnic persecution, rape used as a weapon of war. Entire towns have been emptied out. Aid groups struggle to reach the hungry because checkpoints, bureaucratic obstruction, and sheer violence block the roads. Health systems have collapsed, cholera spreads. To live in Sudan today is to exist in a landscape where the basic institutions of survival are crumbling. But here is where we must ask a deeper question. Why has this war become so destructive? Why is it lasting so long? Why are the two sides so well armed? And the answer lies not just in Sudan itself, but in the global arms trade, in the constant violation of embargoes, and in the willingness of foreign powers to treat Sudan as a chessboard rather than a home for millions of human beings. Weapons, drones, missiles, none of these are made in Sudan. They are imported, supplied, or smuggled in from abroad. Every foreign, supplied drone that bombs a market in Darfur represents a chain of profit for arms manufacturers, a violation of international law, and an implicit message from the global system: your suffering is an opportunity for someone else's enrichment. Sudan's civil war is, in other words, a mirror of the larger global order. Rich countries speak of human rights while their corporations profit from arms deals. Politicians call for peace while they look away from embargo violations. And in the middle are the Sudanese people abandoned to the crossfire. We must also remember the history that prepared the ground for this tragedy. Sudan was shaped by colonial rule, divided deliberately by the British into North and South, Muslims and Christians, Arabs and Africans. The old colonial logic was simple: divide, rule, and extract resources. When independence came, the divisions remained, hardened into the fabric of politics. The decades since have been marked by coups, dictatorships, wars, and economic mismanagement, all in a context where the country's natural wealth, particularly oil and gold, has been targeted by foreign interests. This is the tragic pattern of many post-colonial states' independence in form, dependence in substance. Consider oil. Sudan once held vast oil reserves, but after the secession of South Sudan in 2011, much of that wealth went south. What remained was a state deprived of its main revenue, suddenly desperate and increasingly unstable. Add to that the pressure from the International Monetary Fund, which demanded austerity measures, subsidy cuts, and market reforms in exchange for loans. These policies, far from stabilizing Sudan, deepened poverty and unrest. Bread prices tripled, inflation soared. Ordinary Sudanese bore the brunt of economic restructuring demanded by global finance. And when anger boiled over, when protests demanded change, the military and paramilitary forces were there to crack down. Now, fast forward to today, the war between the SAF and RSF is not simply a clash of generals. It is a struggle over power in a weakened state, a state hollowed out by decades of foreign exploitation, debt, and economic collapse. It is a war fueled by outside arms, by the greed of global merchants of death, and by the strategic calculations of regional powers like Egypt, the Gulf states, and even Russia, all of whom see Sudan as a place to project influence. This is why embargoes are violated with impunity. For some states, supplying weapons to one faction or another buys leverage. For others, it is simply business. And for the big powers, the war in Sudan is never urgent enough to demand real intervention, because unlike wars in Europe or the Middle East, Sudan does not command the same headlines or the same geopolitical importance. The result is a silence that kills, but silence does not mean absence. The fingerprints of global capitalism are all over Sudan's misery. The displacement of 14 million people is not just the result of local enmity. It is the product of an international system that treats some wars as intolerable outrages and others as regrettable but ignorable. When Ukrainian refugees flee, Europe opens its doors. When Sudanese refugees flee, they are met with closed borders, indifference, or hostility. This hierarchy of concern is not accidental. It reflects who is valuable to the system and who is not. When we focus on the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, we are confronted with a scale of suffering that is hard to grasp. 14 million displaced, countless dead, entire communities forced into exile, children conscripted, women violated, families torn apart. But to stop at the human tragedy is not enough. We must examine how this kind of suffering becomes normalized, how it becomes invisible to the wider world. And here, too, the role of the global order is decisive. Aid agencies report that even when food and medicine are available, they cannot be delivered. Convoys are attacked, warehouses looted, workers kidnapped or killed. Roads are unsafe. Fuel shortages cripple delivery vehicles. And behind this lies another fact: the global economy, in its relentless drive for profit, has stripped Sudan of infrastructure that could have made survival easier. Decades of underinvestment, structural adjustment, and capital flight left the country's health systems fragile even before the war began. So when bombs fell, hospitals collapsed almost instantly. This is not a coincidence. It is the outcome of policies that value debt repayment and foreign investor confidence over the welfare of Sudan's people. We must also look at how ethnicity is used as a weapon in Sudan's war. Reports of targeted killings, of ethnic cleansing in Darfur, remind us that old divisions are deliberately inflamed by those seeking power. The RSF, descended from the Janjaweed, uses ethnic persecution to consolidate control. But ethnic hatred does not emerge spontaneously. It is manipulated, cultivated, and exploited. And it becomes even deadlier when combined with imported drones, rifles, and rocket launchers. Once again, what might have remained a local struggle is magnified by the global arms trade into a catastrophe of regional proportions. And let us not forget the refugees. Where do 14 million displaced Sudanese go? Some cross into Chad, South Sudan, or Egypt. But these neighboring countries are already struggling with their own crisis. Camps are overcrowded, underfunded, and neglected. International donors pledge support, but rarely deliver enough. Western governments that spent billions funding wars in Iraq or Ukraine find only crumbs when it comes to feeding starving Sudanese families. Here, the double standard of the global system is undeniable. Money can always be found for war, but never enough for peace. The crisis in Sudan is also a warning. It shows us how fragile states can become breeding grounds for endless conflict once economic collapse sets in. Austerity and privatization, demanded by global financial institutions, weakened Sudan's government long before the war. When subsidies on bread and fuel were cut, people rioted. When wages collapsed, resentment grew. The seeds of war were planted not just by local leaders, but by the dictates of international lenders. We often imagine war as an explosion of violence, but it begins in quieter ways, in the slow strangling of economies, in the denial of dignity, in the erosion of hope. By the time the first shots are fired, the deeper war has already been waged, the war of economic dispossession. And so we must ask, who benefits from Sudan's agony? Certainly not its people, but there are beneficiaries. Arms dealers profit as weapons flow in. Smugglers profit from sanctions evasion. Regional powers profit from Sudan's weakness, securing influence over borders, trade routes, or mineral resources. And foreign investors, often through opaque networks, profit from Sudan's gold smuggled out by the ton to markets abroad. Here again we see the familiar pattern. War destroys lives, but it enriches the few who sit at the top of the global hierarchy. Sudan is not unique in this regard. The same pattern can be traced in Yemen, in Libya, in the Congo. Wars that seem local are fueled by global systems of profit. They are sustained by the indifference of wealthy nations. They are made worse by the inequalities of capitalism. If we fail to see this pattern, we reduce Sudan to a sad African story, when in fact it is a global story, one that implicates us all. Now, imagine for a moment what real international solidarity would look like. It would mean embargoes that are actually enforced, cutting off weapons to both sides. It would mean emergency airlifts of food and medicine, funded not by charity but by the redirection of military budgets. It would mean debt cancellation for Sudan, freeing resources for reconstruction. It would mean a recognition that Sudanese lives are as valuable as European or American lives. But none of this happens because the system we live in is not designed for solidarity. It is designed for profit and for power. And so the war continues. When I speak of capitalism as a system, I mean exactly this. A system in which the suffering of millions can be ignored because it does not generate returns for investors. A system in which embargoes are proclaimed but not enforced because enforcement would cut into the profits of arms traders. A system in which humanitarian aid is treated as an afterthought while military spending grows endlessly. Sudan's war is not an accident of history. It is a logical outcome of this system. And let us not forget, wars like Sudan's produce ripple effects that extend far beyond the country itself. Refugees move across borders, straining neighboring states. Instability creates openings for extremist groups. Trade routes are disrupted. Food supplies are threatened, not only in Africa but in global markets. What begins as a local conflict inevitably becomes a global problem. Yet the world refuses to act until the crisis spills over. This is the short-sightedness of our global order. It ignores suffering until the consequences can no longer be contained. If we want to understand Sudan today, we must not only analyze its present, but also confront the legacies that brought it here. Colonialism did not just redraw borders, it set in motion the logic of exploitation. Britain ruled Sudan not to develop it, but to extract from it, to divide its people so that control could be maintained. Those divisions did not vanish with independence. They were inherited, reinforced, and in many ways deepened by the pressures of global capitalism. Post-colonial states like Sudan were left with weak institutions, heavy debts, and economies oriented toward the export of raw materials. These vulnerabilities made them easy targets for manipulation, intervention, and exploitation. Sudan's gold reserves are a perfect example. Instead of being used to build hospitals, schools, and infrastructure, much of the gold leaves the country through smuggling networks. Reports indicate that some of this gold ends up in Dubai, some in Russia, some in other parts of the global economy. This is wealth produced by Sudanese land and Sudanese labor, but it enriches foreign elites. Meanwhile, ordinary Sudanese people live in poverty and hunger. Here we see the fundamental injustice. A country rich in resources is poor in life because global capitalism funnels wealth upward and outward. Now consider the role of foreign powers. Egypt supports the Sudanese armed forces, hoping to maintain a friendly military regime on its southern border. The United Arab Emirates has been accused of supplying weapons to the Rapid Support Forces, motivated by its own strategic interests. Russia has sought influence through the Wagner Group, trading security services for access to Sudan's gold. The United States and Europe, while publicly calling for peace, have prioritized other theaters of conflict, leaving Sudan to languish. Each foreign power sees Sudan not as a community of human beings, but as a terrain of competition. And this is why the war continues. The arms embargo, repeatedly violated, is another illustration of hypocrisy. On paper, the international community has declared that Sudan should not receive weapons. In practice, drones and missiles continue to flow. How? Because profit comes before principle. Because enforcement would require the great powers to police their own allies and corporations. Because ultimately, the lives of Sudanese civilians do not weigh as heavily as the revenues of the arms industry. And so the embargo is a fiction, a performance of concern that hides a reality of complicity. What, then, are the prospects for peace? We must be honest. As long as both sides have access to weapons, and as long as foreign powers see advantage in fueling the conflict, peace will remain elusive. Ceasefires are declared and broken. Negotiations start and collapse. Civilians remain trapped. Without a fundamental shift in how the global system treats Sudan, there is little reason to expect the violence to end soon. But Sudan also reveals something larger, the fragility of the global system itself. We live in a world where war can destroy a country, displace half its people, and still remain peripheral in international politics. We live in a world where the cries of starving children in Darfur are drowned out by debates in Washington or Brussels about tariffs, oil prices, or elections. We live in a world that has normalized selective compassion outrage for some wars, indifference for others. This selective compassion is not just a moral failure. It is a structural feature of a system that prioritizes wealth and power above human need. For those of us who care about building a better future, Sudan's war forces us to ask hard questions. What would it mean to design a global order based on solidarity rather than profit? What would it mean to place human survival above corporate revenue? What would it mean to treat African lives as fully equal to European or American lives? These questions are uncomfortable because they demand not only policy changes but systemic transformation. They require us to confront capitalism itself. Capitalism has always thrived on inequality between classes, between nations, between regions. The war in Sudan exposes this inequality in stark terms. A nation rich in resources is condemned to misery because its wealth is siphoned off. A population in need of aid is abandoned because helping them does not serve the interests of the powerful. An embargo is ignored because profit outweighs principle. These are not accidents. They are the logic of a system designed to generate wealth for the few at the expense of the many. We can, of course, describe Sudan in the language of geopolitics, a conflict between factions, a humanitarian disaster, a regional crisis. But to stop there is to miss the deeper truth. Sudan is also a mirror. It reflects the priorities of a global system that has accepted endless war as normal, that has turned suffering into business, that has taught us to rank lives according to strategic value. When we look at Sudan, we are not only seeing Sudan, we are seeing the world we have built. And perhaps that is the most sobering lesson. The Sudanese civil war is not only a Sudanese tragedy, it is a human tragedy produced by structures that implicate us all. To truly honor the suffering of Sudan's people, we cannot simply call for a ceasefire. We must also question the system that makes such wars inevitable. We must ask why embargoes are unenforced, why aid is underfunded, why resources are stolen, why lives are devalued. And in asking these questions, we are pushed toward the realization that peace will never be secure until the global order itself is transformed. So, when we hear about Darfur, when we see the images of starving families, we must resist the temptation to treat this as distant. Sudan is not far away. It is here in the logic of our world. It is here in the profits of arms companies headquartered in Europe and the United States. It is here in the smuggled gold that ends up in international markets. It is here in the refugee crisis that touch every border. Sudan's war belongs to all of us because it arises from a system we all inhabit. The question, then, is whether we will continue to accept that system. Will we continue to live in a world where wars like Sudan's are allowed to burn endlessly?